What's going on, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. If you've been trying to decide which tank to invest your time into on Ascension, this is the video for you. Today we're ranking every single tank specialization currently available and talking about what they actually feel like to play, not just what's theoretically strongest on paper. Now before we jump into the list, I want to make something very clear. This isn't based on spreadsheets, damage simulations, or someone else's rankings. Every placement in this tier list comes from my own experience leveling and playing these tanks. Most of them I've taken into the level 30 to 40 range, with several pushed even further, and I've run plenty of dungeons on each one to get a solid feel for how they perform. This also isn't assuming you're wearing perfect gear, with every best-in-slot enchant, legendary setup, or fully optimized profession bonuses. Most players aren't going to have that while they're leveling, so I wanted to judge these tanks in a way that's actually useful for the average player. I'm looking at a few different things. First is threat generation. Can the tank reliably keep enemies focused on them, even when your DPS starts blasting everything? Second is survivability. Can they stay alive without making the healer sweat every single pull? Third is self-healing and defensive cooldowns. Every healer has bad moments. Sometimes they're moving, sometimes they're drinking, and sometimes they're just trying to recover after someone stands in fire. A tank that can keep themselves alive during those moments gets huge bonus points from me. I'm also looking at mobility, ease of play, dungeon performance, and overall enjoyment. Because let's be honest, even if something is technically strong, if it feels miserable to play, most people aren't going to stick with it. One last thing before we get started. If your favorite class ends up lower than you expected, don't take it personally. Every tank in Ascension is capable of completing content when played well. Some just require more effort than others. With all that out of the way, let's start with one of the strongest tanks in the entire game. Cultist, S tier. We're kicking things off with Cultist, and honestly, this class surprised me more than almost any other tank. If your number one priority is holding threat, Cultist is absolutely incredible. Once you've established aggro, it becomes incredibly difficult for anyone else to pull enemies away from you. Even those overgeared DPS players that love opening every pull with their biggest cooldowns are going to have a hard time stealing mobs from a well-played cultist. That's something I really appreciate, because nothing feels worse than constantly chasing enemies around a dungeon while your mage accidentally tanks everything. Cultist simply doesn't have that problem. Its AoE threat generation is among the best in Ascension, which makes large pulls feel incredibly smooth. But threat isn't the only thing going for it. The class also has respectable self-healing, excellent defensive tools, and enough sustain to comfortably survive encounters that would make other tanks panic. Now, it isn't completely without flaws. The biggest mechanic you need to learn is managing your sanity resource. If you ignore it, you're eventually going to start hurting yourself more than helping yourself. This isn't one of those tanks where you can completely shut your brain off and mash buttons. You actually need to pay attention to your resource management. Fortunately, once you get used to it, it becomes second nature. Another thing worth mentioning is healer synergy. Cultist absolutely shines when paired with a competent healer. Because you can gather enormous pulls so quickly, your healer has time to prepare while you're establishing threat. Once everything is grouped together, the dungeon starts flowing incredibly smoothly. As far as leveling goes, I had a blast. Questing felt fast. Dungeon tanking felt even better. I rarely found myself struggling unless I made mistakes. Overall, if someone asked me for a tank that can comfortably handle almost every type of PvE content, Cultist would be one of the first recommendations I'd make. Easy S tier, no question. Starcaller, a tier. Next up is Starcaller. This is one of those tanks that becomes stronger the more coordinated your group is. If you're playing with friends or people communicating over voice chat, Starcaller feels fantastic. If you're running random dungeon groups, well, it can get a little messy. Here's why. Starcaller wants to gather enemies before fully committing. Once everything is grouped together, its AoE threat becomes amazing. The problem is getting to that point. If your DPS starts attacking halfway through the pull, there's a very good chance they'll rip threat before you finished setting everything up. That's not necessarily the class being weak. It's more of a communication issue. Once Starcaller establishes control, it's extremely difficult for enemies to leave. Its AoE damage is excellent. Its crowd control feels satisfying. Large pulls become very manageable. The downside is sustain. Compared to some of the higher-ranked tanks, Starcaller doesn't have amazing self-healing. You're relying much more heavily on your healer. If your healer falls behind, you're definitely going to notice it. That doesn't make it a bad tank. Far from it. It simply means you have to respect your cooldowns more carefully than something like Cultist or Blood Mage. After spending quite a few levels with Starcaller, I walked away impressed. I don't think it's quite S tier because of that dependency on teamwork, but in organized groups, it's incredibly strong. That's why I'm comfortably placing it in A tier. Sun Cleric, a tier. Moving on, we've got the Sun Cleric, and I have to admit, this was probably one of the most enjoyable tanks I played purely from a fun factor standpoint. There's just something satisfying about the visual effects and sound design of this class. Every ability feels impactful, and it really sells the fantasy of being this holy guardian standing on the front line protecting your group. Now, visuals alone don't make a class good, so let's talk about performance. For me, Sun Cleric lands comfortably in a tier. The biggest reason is survivability. This class has incredible sustain thanks to its self-healing toolkit. There were so many moments while leveling where I thought I was about to die, only to chain together a few abilities and watch my health shoot right back up. If you're someone who doesn't like relying entirely on your healer, Sun Cleric feels really rewarding. Your healer still matters, of course, but you have enough built into your own kit that you can cover mistakes much better than a lot of other tanks. Where I think the class falls just short of S tier is its threat generation. Single target threat feels perfectly fine. Bosses are never really an issue. The problem starts when you're pulling 5, 6, or even 10 enemies at once. Compared to tanks like Cultist or Venomancer, you have to work noticeably harder to keep everything glued to you. It's not impossible, it just requires a little more effort and a little more awareness. You'll occasionally have that one mob decide your healer looks like a better target, and you'll need to quickly grab it back. Another thing I noticed while leveling was that Sun Cleric feels extremely forgiving. If you're brand new to tanking in Ascension, this is honestly one of the classes I'd recommend looking at. You have strong defenses, good self-heals, simple cooldown management, and you aren't overwhelmed with complicated mechanics right away. The learning curve is pretty smooth. I leveled mine into the mid-30s before moving on to another class, and throughout that entire process, I never really had a moment where I thought, this class feels weak. It always felt reliable, consistent. Maybe not flashy in terms of damage or giant AoE pulls, but dependable. Sometimes that's exactly what you want from a tank. Overall, Sun Cleric is one of those classes that's never going to disappoint your group. It may not dominate every category, but it doesn't have any glaring weaknesses either. That's why I'm giving it a solid A tier. Toxined Rune Master, B tier. Now let's talk about Rune Master. This one is probably going to be one of my more controversial rankings, because I know there are players out there who absolutely love this class. For me though, Rune Master lands in B tier, and honestly, a lot of that comes down to how the class feels to play. It's one of the more unique tanks in Ascension. Instead of feeling like a traditional heavily armored frontliner, Rune Master almost feels like a ranged caster that's forced to fight in melee. It's a very strange hybrid playstyle. Some people absolutely love that. Personally, it never really clicked for me. Now that's not to say the class is bad, far from it. It has respectable defensive cooldowns, decent crowd control, good utility, and once you understand how the rune system works, you can pull off some really impressive combinations. The issue is getting to that point. Compared to something like Templar or Blood Mage, Rune Master asks a lot more from the player. You need to understand your runes. You need to know your rotation. You need to know when to spend resources and when to save them. If you don't, your performance drops pretty quickly. That learning curve alone is enough to push it down a tier for me. I also felt like I had to communicate with my healer more often than I did on other tanks. Whenever I planned a larger pull, I'd usually give them a heads up because there were definitely moments where my survivability dipped harder than I expected. Once cooldowns were rolling, everything felt fine, but outside of those windows, the class could feel surprisingly vulnerable. That said, Rune Master has a very dedicated player base for a reason. Once mastered, it can absolutely perform. I just don't think the average player is going to get the same value out of it compared to some of the simpler tanks higher on this list. If you're willing to put in the time and really learn the mechanics, you'll probably rank this class much higher than I do. For everyone else, B tier feels like a fair placement. Black's Primalist. B tier. Next up is Primalist. This is another class that honestly came really close to moving into a tier. There's a lot to like here. The first thing you'll notice is just how much area damage this class can put out. It feels like every few seconds, you're activating another ability that hits everything around you. That naturally makes threat generation pretty easy. If your goal is running through dungeons pulling pack after pack, Primalist handles that job really well. Aggro wasn't my issue with this class, Survivability was. Compared to some of the other tanks I've played, Primalist simply feels squishier. Now don't misunderstand me, the class absolutely has defensive cooldowns. When those cooldowns are active, you feel incredibly durable. You can shrug off some pretty big hits. The problem is what happens after those cooldowns expire. That's when I really started noticing the damage coming in. Unlike Blood Mage or Cultist, where you constantly feel like you're recovering health or mitigating incoming damage, Primalist has moments where you're just waiting for abilities to come back. Those gaps are where things can get dangerous. If your healer is paying attention, it's usually not a problem. But if they're struggling or running low on mana, those windows become much more noticeable. The class itself is still fun. It has great animations, strong AoE pressure, and leveling feels fairly smooth. I just wish the baseline durability matched the rest of the toolkit a little better. With future balance changes, I could absolutely see Primalist moving into a tier. Right now though, I'm keeping it in B, not because it's weak, but because I think there are simply better options available. Reaper, B tier. Next up, we've got the Reaper. Now, I know this is probably going to be another class that gets people talking in the comments, because I've seen some absolutely insane Reaper players. There are people out there making this class look completely broken. But for the average player, and that's who I'm trying to make this tier list for, I think Reaper lands comfortably in B tier. The biggest thing to understand about Reaper is that it's a very different kind of tank. It isn't built around standing there and soaking damage like some of the more traditional tanks. Instead, it's all about mobility, positioning, and knowing exactly when to use your abilities. That's great if you already know the class, but if you're still learning, it can feel pretty unforgiving. One of the coolest things about Reaper is its mobility. Being able to teleport around the battlefield gives you options that a lot of other tanks simply don't have. You can quickly reposition enemies, dodge dangerous mechanics, or instantly get back onto a boss after moving away from an AoE. It makes the class feel fast, almost assassin-like. That's something I really enjoyed while leveling. Unfortunately, mobility alone doesn't make a great PvE tank. The biggest issue I had was consistency. There were plenty of pulls where everything felt fantastic. Then there were other pulls where I suddenly felt incredibly squishy, especially if my defensive cooldowns weren't available. Gear also seems to matter much more on Reaper than it does on several other tanks. If your gear starts falling behind, you're going to notice. If your enchants aren't up to date, you're going to notice. If your professions haven't kept your equipment competitive, you're definitely going to notice. Compared to something like Blood Mage, which feels strong almost immediately, Reaper asks for a much bigger investment before it really starts shining. Now let's talk about PvP for a second, because honestly, this is where Reaper becomes a completely different monster. Teleporting around players, disrupting positioning, surviving longer than people expect, and constantly applying pressure makes this class incredibly frustrating to fight against. If I were making a PvP tank tier list, Reaper would be significantly higher, but this video is focused on PvE dungeons, heroics, mythics, raids, and in those situations, I just think there are more reliable choices. That's why I'm putting Reaper in B tier, not because it's weak, but because it asks more from the player while giving less consistency than several of the tanks above it. Venomancer, S tier. Now, let's talk about one of my favorite classes in the entire game, Venomancer. This class is ridiculous. Seriously, no matter what role you decide to play, Venomancer somehow manages to perform at an incredibly high level. Damage dealer? Excellent. Healer? Excellent. Tank? Also excellent. It's honestly one of the most complete class designs currently available. When it comes to tanking specifically, Venomancer checks almost every box I'm looking for. Threat generation? Fantastic. Self-healing? Excellent. Damage mitigation? Very strong. Ranged abilities? Yep. Melee abilities? Absolutely. Crowd control? No problem. It feels like every time you think, I wish this class had, it already does. One of my favorite things about Venomancer is how quickly it establishes threat. Poison spread incredibly efficiently across enemy packs. That means the moment you engage a pull, enemies immediately start paying attention to you. That's something I value a lot when tanking random groups. We've all had those dungeon runs where the hunter opens with multi-shot before you've even touched the mobs. Or the mage immediately drops Blizzard across the entire room. Venomancer handles those situations much better than most tanks. Even if someone gets a little trigger happy, you usually have enough tools to immediately pull everything back. Its survivability is also outstanding. The combination of self-healing and defensive abilities creates a tank that feels incredibly safe to play. There were very few moments while leveling where I genuinely felt like I was in danger. Even when my health dropped, I always felt like I had an answer. That's a great feeling as a tank. The only real complaint I have is mobility. Compared to classes like Blood Mage or Reaper, Venomancer feels just a little slower. It's not painfully slow. It's just noticeable. Sometimes you'll wish you had one extra movement ability to quickly jump into the next pack. But honestly, that's a pretty small complaint considering everything else the class offers. If this were an overall class ranking instead of just tanks, Venomancer would still be one of my highest rated classes. That's how versatile it is. Whether you're leveling, farming dungeons, pushing in-game content, or just looking for something reliable, Venomancer consistently delivers. Easy S tier. One of the safest recommendations I can give. Hashtag Felsworn, a tier. Alright, this one hurts me a little. Anyone who's watched the channel for a while probably knows I love Felsworn. Whenever people ask me about fun classes in Ascension, Felsworn is almost always one of the first ones I bring up. It's flashy, it's aggressive, it has great visuals, and it's just incredibly satisfying to play. So why isn't it in S tier? Because we're judging it as a tank, not as an overall class. And that's where I think it falls just short. Let's start with the positives. Felsworn has excellent defensive cooldowns. It has solid threat generation, good damage, great class fantasy. It feels powerful. You always feel like you're controlling the fight instead of reacting to it. The problem starts once your defensive cooldowns begin disappearing. Unlike Blood Mage or Cultist, Felsworn doesn't have nearly the same level of reliable self-healing. That means you're much more dependent on your healer. If you've got a great healer behind you, you're going to feel amazing. If your healer starts struggling, you notice almost immediately. That's really the biggest reason I'm keeping it out of S tier. Not because it can't tank difficult content. It absolutely can, but it doesn't have that same level of independence that the very best tanks possess. Outside of that issue, though, the class is fantastic. It has enough damage to make solo questing enjoyable. It has enough mobility to keep dungeon pacing smooth. And its overall gameplay loop stays fun even after dozens of hours. If you're the kind of player who values fun over absolute optimization, Felsworn is still an excellent pick. Would I recommend it for heroic dungeons? Absolutely. Would I recommend it for Mythics? Definitely. High-end progression raids? You can make it work. I just think several other tanks perform that role with a little less effort. That's why Felsworn lands comfortably in a tier, still an amazing class, just not quite at the very top. Black Blood Mage, S tier. Now we get to Blood Mage, and honestly, this class feels like the developers sat down and said, let's make a tank that can do almost everything. Because that's exactly how it plays. The first thing you'll notice is mobility. Blood Mage is fast, really fast. Being able to leap into packs, reposition quickly, and react to mechanics makes dungeon tanking feel incredibly smooth. You're never stuck slowly waddling between enemy groups. That alone improves the overall pacing of the class. But mobility isn't the reason it's S tier, it's everything else. Threat generation is excellent. AoE pulls feel effortless. Boss encounters are incredibly comfortable. Self-healing is among the best in the game. Even after taking heavy damage, you constantly have ways to recover health without relying entirely on your healer. That's huge, because every healer eventually has moments where they're moving, avoiding mechanics, or simply trying to conserve mana. Blood Mage covers those situations beautifully. Defensively, it also feels incredibly complete. You're rarely caught without an answer. Need damage reduction? You've got it. Need healing? You've got it. Need mobility? Already there. Need to instantly grab a new pack of enemies? No problem. The class simply flows from one pull to the next. Leveling also felt fantastic. I never reached a point where I thought the class was slowing down. It always had another tool unlocking, another ability improving the rotation, another reason to keep playing. That's exactly what you want from a leveling experience. By the time I finished my testing, Blood Mage had become one of the easiest tanks for me to recommend. Whether you're a brand new player or someone looking to push high-end content, Blood Mage performs at an incredibly high level without demanding an insane amount of effort. That's why it's comfortably sitting in S tier. Not because it's overpowered, but because it consistently excels in almost every category that matters for tanking. Witch Hunter, a tier. Now let's move on to Witch Hunter. This is one of those classes that I think has one of the highest skill ceilings of any tank in Ascension. If you've ever grouped with a really experienced Witch Hunter, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. They make the class look completely unfair. They're flying around the battlefield, keeping aggro on everything, barely taking damage, and somehow still putting out respectable DPS. Then you play the class yourself, and you quickly realize there's a lot more going on than meets the eye. That's why I think Witch Hunter is one of the hardest tanks to rank. For the average player, I'm putting it in A tier. For someone who has mastered every part of the class, you could absolutely make an argument that it's S tier. The difference really comes down to knowledge. Unlike something like Blood Mage, where the rotation feels fairly natural after a few levels, Witch Hunter has a lot of moving pieces. You're constantly managing cooldowns, watching procs, planning your positioning, making sure you're using your defensive abilities before you actually need them instead of after you've already taken the damage. If you fall behind, the class can punish you pretty hard, but once everything clicks, oh man, this class is incredibly satisfying. Threat generation is excellent, mobility is fantastic. You have answers for most situations, and once you become comfortable with the rotation, you start feeling almost untouchable. I also really enjoyed how active the gameplay feels. Some tanks have moments where you're basically waiting for cooldowns to come back. Witch Hunter almost never has that problem. You're constantly making decisions. There's always another ability to weave into your rotation, always another cooldown to optimize. For players who enjoy engaging gameplay, instead of just pressing the same 3 buttons over and over, Witch Hunter is an excellent choice. The only reason I'm not putting it into S tier for everyone is because I don't think the average player will unlock the full potential of the class right away. There's a learning curve here. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to miss time cooldowns. You're going to lose aggro occasionally while learning, and that's perfectly normal. Once you get past that stage, though, this class becomes incredibly rewarding, so for me, a solid A tier, with S tier potential in the hands of someone who really knows what they're doing. Or Knight of Zuroth, B tier. Next up is Knight of Xoroth. I'll be honest with you guys, this is probably the class on the list that I spent the most time trying to understand. Not because it's weak, but because it never really felt intuitive to me. There are definitely moments where Knight of Xoroth feels amazing. The AoE threat is respectable, the defensive toolkit has some really strong abilities, and the self-healing potential can be surprisingly impressive once everything starts working together. But getting to that point, that's where I struggled. Compared to some of the higher-ranked tanks, Knight of Xoroth feels slower to get going. The leveling experience never felt bad, but it also never had that moment where I thought, wow, this class is incredible. Instead, it felt more like a gradual climb. Every few levels it got a little better. Every few new abilities added another piece to the puzzle. Eventually everything starts coming together. The problem is that several other tanks feel stronger much earlier. That matters, because most players spend a lot of time leveling before they ever reach endgame. If a class feels slow for 30 or 40 levels, that's going to affect how people view it. I also found myself relying a bit more on gear than I expected. Once I upgraded my equipment, the class became noticeably smoother. Damage intake felt better, threat generation improved, everything started flowing more naturally, but without those upgrades, it definitely felt a little rough around the edges. Now, I know there are dedicated Knight of Xoroth players who absolutely love this class. And honestly, I get why. There's something really satisfying about finally mastering a class that has a higher learning curve. I just think there are easier options that provide similar or even better results. That's why I'm putting it in B tier. It's not a bad tank, not even close. It's just one that requires a little more patience before it really starts paying off. Or Templar, high a tier, almost S. Now let's talk about Templar. This class came incredibly close to making it into S tier. In fact, if you asked me on a different day, I might honestly put it there. That's how close it is. Templar is one of the most complete tank packages in Ascension. It has fantastic defensive cooldowns, reliable self-healing, excellent survivability, great mobility, strong threat generation, and on top of all that, it's surprisingly easy to learn. That's a combination you don't see very often. Some classes are incredibly strong, but difficult to master. Others are beginner-friendly, but fall off later. Templar somehow manages to do both. While leveling, this class felt amazing. Questing was smooth. Dungeon queues were easy. Large pulls felt comfortable. I never found myself questioning whether I could survive something. Instead, I was usually wondering how many more enemies I could grab before the healer started panicking. That's always a good sign. One thing that really stood out to me was how independent Templar feels. You obviously still want a healer. You're a tank. That's their job. But if something goes wrong, maybe the healer dies, maybe they get stunned, maybe they're out of mana, Templars have enough tools to keep themselves alive far longer than you'd expect. That's incredibly valuable and difficult content. I've also watched plenty of players solo normal dungeons on Templar, not because the class is broken, but because it simply has such a complete toolkit. Good sustain, good damage, great defenses, everything works together. Now, the reason I'm keeping it just below S tier is because I think Blood Mage, Venomancer, and Cultist still edge it out slightly in overall consistency. It's close, very close, but if we're being picky, and that's what tier lists are all about, I think Templar sits right at the top of a tier. Miss S tier by just a tiny bit. Actor Guardian, a tier, last but definitely not least. Guardian. This class surprised me more than I expected. At first, I honestly wasn't impressed. The early levels felt a little underwhelming. I wasn't seeing huge damage numbers. The self-healing wasn't anything special. Nothing immediately stood out. Then I started understanding the rotation. And suddenly, everything changed. Guardian isn't built around healing through damage. It's built around preventing damage from happening in the first place. That's a huge difference. Once you understand how your shields, mitigation abilities, and cooldowns work together, your health bar barely moves. Seriously. There were dungeon pulls where I looked over at my healer afterward and realized they barely had to cast anything on me. Not because I was healing myself, but because I simply wasn't taking meaningful damage. That's a completely different style of tanking compared to Blood Mage or Sun Cleric. Instead of recovering health, you're preventing yourself from losing it. I actually think Guardian is one of the better tanks for players who enjoy planning ahead. You're rewarded for anticipating damage instead of reacting to it. If you know a boss ability is coming, you can prepare for it before it lands. When you do that consistently, Guardian feels incredibly durable. The biggest downside is that it takes time to learn. If your rotation falls apart, you're going to feel much weaker. There's definitely a skill gap between an average Guardian and a great Guardian. Fortunately, once everything clicks, the class becomes extremely reliable. I don't think it quite reaches S tier because it lacks some of the flexibility and self-recovery of the very best tanks. But I have absolutely no problem recommending Guardian to anyone looking for a dependable endgame tank. For me, it's a very solid A tier. Latzer's final thoughts. So after spending time leveling these tanks, running dungeons, experimenting with different builds, and seeing how they perform in real groups, this is where I stand. S tier belongs to the tanks that consistently perform well in almost every situation without asking too much from the player. Cultist, Venomancer, and Blood Mage are the standouts for me. They have incredible threat generation, excellent survivability, strong self-healing, and enough flexibility to handle just about anything the game throws at them. A tier is full of tanks that are absolutely capable of clearing all the content in the game, but might require a little more experience, better communication, or stronger gear to reach their full potential. If you enjoy any of these classes, don't let the ranking stop you from playing them. They're all excellent choices. B tier doesn't mean bad. It simply means these classes either have a steeper learning curve, rely more heavily on gear, or have weaknesses that become more noticeable compared to the higher ranked tanks. In the right hands, every single one of them can still succeed. At the end of the day, the best tank isn't always the one sitting at the top of a tier list. It's the one you actually enjoy playing. A player who knows their class inside and out is almost always going to outperform someone playing the best class without understanding it. So use this tier list as a guide, not as a rulebook. Try different classes. Experiment with different playstyles. Find the one that clicks for you. Because that's what Ascension is all about. If you disagree with any of these rankings, and I'm sure some of you will, let me know down in the comments. I'm always interested to hear different opinions, especially from players who have pushed these classes much further than I have. Who do you think deserves S tier? Who do you think I rank too high? And which tank do you think is the most underrated in the current meta? If you enjoyed the video and found it helpful, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe for more Ascension content, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next tier list. We've still got healers, melee DPS, range DPS, and an overall class ranking coming soon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one. Take care, everyone.